That's an issue. Hello. Welcome to Sensibility. Again, I don't know how many days we've been doing this. I could probably calculate it backwards, but I don't. I'm downstairs today because I am editing a project that I shot yesterday, which was awful and is still awful. Hello. Yes, at least 4 days, maybe so. Hello, Dane. Yeah, so my dad has a little workstation set up downstairs, so I've invaded it and I'm editing down here today. And I did not feel like unplugging the like 6 things that I have plugged into my computer and going back upstairs. So my dad is eating lunch. You may hear that. I don't know what my mother is doing. I'm trying to sit in this chair. Yeah, so as I stall time, the usual. It's Mother's Day. Happy Mother's Day. I hope all of you remembered that. And if you're in a good spot with your mom, or your mom is, who knows? Who knows? Yeah, not a lot. We're gonna go out to get Italian. Not go out, obviously. We're going to retrieve Italian food from our favorite Italian restaurant, and hopefully that will all be fine. Ooh, I'm falling out of my chair. Okay, let's do a review of what happened yesterday. So. Yesterday. Okay, so yesterday. Oh dear, that's unfortunate. I made a card and then I made breakfast. That's what I did for Mother's Day because I forgot about this project, which is a disaster. Anyways, so yesterday, Marianne and Eleanor had seen Willoughby at this ball, and Willoughby like pretended not to know them, and Marianne was like, So the next day, she like writes a letter to Willoughby, and she and Eleanor are just like, what is going on? And so at breakfast, somebody comes in, delivers a letter to Marianne. Marianne runs off. Eleanor's like, oh my God, Mrs. Jennings doesn't notice. Eleanor's freaking out. So then she goes to Marianne, and Marianne's like lying on the bed, face down, with like 3 letters strewn around her. Willoughby, indeed. With 3 letters strewn around her, and she's like, and so Eleanor comes and she picks up the letter from Willoughby, and Willoughby's like, hey, sorry if you were ever under an impression that like I thought about you, because I never thought about you, and I'm actually engaged to another girl. So like, it's too bad that you thought that, because you were wrong. And yeah. And Eleanor's like, what? And Marianne's obviously distraught. So then she reads the notes that Marianne sent him, and she's like, Marianne was like, basically like, the first one was like, oh my God, hey, I'm in London, come say hi. The second one was like, it's so funny how you were invited to this thing with me last night and you didn't come, haha. Anyways, why haven't you responded to me? Get back to me soon, toodles. And the third one was like, yo, what's happening? Like, if something's wrong, like return me my like 3 letters and my lock of hair. And he does, and he's like, yeah, I know you gave this lock of hair to me. And she's like, that's not true. You asked me for it. But anyways, Willoughby's a lying butthole, and we don't like him. But we knew that. I knew that. Well, I know we knew that. So the second chapter was like Colonel Brandon like comes running to the door and is like, hello, it's my time to shine, ladies. But of course Marianne is like not going to see him, which is typical. But Mrs. Jennings has all these plans. She's like, it'd be pretty good for Marianne if she went with Colonel Brandon. In the chapter before, Eleanor had been like, well, it's kind of rude way to break off an engagement. And Marianne's like, we were never engaged. And Eleanor's like, what? But they were never engaged. But we kind of knew that too, because she's 16 and she's young. And I don't know. People lie, and it's not nice. Yeah, so that's what happened yesterday. I don't think anything else really happened in the chapter with Mrs. Jennings besides Mrs. Jennings trying to interfere and like ply poor Marianne with a lot of wine. 16 really is not a time to be engaged. I have to agree. Okay, let's get this thing on the road. They're still in London. I don't know what's what's gonna happen. What's his face is getting married to Miss Gray. Okay. Chapter 9. From a night of more sleep than she had expected, Marianne awoke the next morning to the same consciousness of misery in which she had closed her eyes. Eleanor encouraged her as much as possible to talk of what she felt, and before breakfast was ready they had gone through the subject again and again, with the same steady conviction and affectionate counsel on Eleanor's side, the same impetuous feelings and varying opinion on Marianne's. Sorry, there was a cat hair in my mouth. A typical occurrence. On Marianne's before. Sometimes she could believe Willoughby to be as unfortunate and as innocent as herself, and at others lost every consolation in the impossibility of acquitting him. At one moment she was absolutely indifferent to the observation of all the world. At another she would seclude herself from it forever, and at a third could resist it with energy. In one thing, however, she was uniform, when it came to the point, in avoiding, where it was possible, the presence of Mrs. Jennings, and in a determined silence when obliged to endure it. Her heart was hardened against the belief of Mrs. Jennings entering into her sorrows with any compassion. No, 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 it cannot be, she cried. She cannot feel. Her kindness is not sympathy, her good nature is not tenderness. All that she wants is gossip, and she only likes me now because I supply it. Eleanor had not needed this to be assured of the injustice to which her sister was often led in her opinion of others, by the irritable refinement of her own mind and the too great importance placed by her on the delicacies of a strong sensibility and the graces of a polished manner. Like half the rest of the world, if more than half there be that are clever and good, Marianne, with excellent abilities and an excellent disposition, was neither reasonable nor candid. She expected from other people the same opinions and feelings as her own, and she judged of their motives by the immediate effect their action by the immediate effect of their actions on herself. Thus a circumstance occurred while the sisters were together in their own room after breakfast, which sunk the heart of Mrs. Jennings still lower in her estimation, because, through her own weakness, it chanced to prove a source of fresh pain to herself, though Mrs. Jennings was governed in it by an impulse of the utmost goodwill. My dog has come to visit, but I can't see where I just heard him. With the letter in her outstretched hand, and countenance gaily smiling, from the persuasion of bringing comfort, she entered their room, saying, "Now, my dear, I bring you something I am sure will do you good." Marianne heard enough. In one moment her imagination placed before her a letter from Willoughby, full of tenderness and contrition, explanatory of all that had passed, satisfactory, convincing, and instantly followed by Willoughby himself, rushing eagerly into the room to enforce at her feet, by the eloquence of his eyes, the assurances of his letter. The work of one moment was destroyed by the next. The handwriting of her mother, never till then unwelcome, was before her, and in the acuteness of the disappointment which followed such an ecstasy of more than hope, she felt as if, till that instant, she had never suffered. Oofda. The cruelty of Mrs. Jennings, no language within her reach in her moment of happiest eloquence could have expressed, and now she could reproach her only by the tears which streamed from her eyes with passionate violence. A reproach, however, so entirely lost on its object, that after many expressions of pity she withdrew, still referring her to the letter for comfort. But the letter, when she was calm enough to read it, brought little comfort. Willoughby filled every page. Her mother, still confident of their engagement, and relying as warmly as ever on his constancy. Sorry, my nose is running a lot today. I don't know why, so I'm going to have to take some nose breaks. Everybody loves a good nose break. Okay. And relying as warmly as ever on his constancy, had only been roused by Eleanor's application to entreat from Marianne greater openness towards them both, and this with such tenderness towards her, such affection for Willoughby, and such a conviction of their future happiness in each other, that she wept with agony through the whole of it. All her impatience to be at home again now returned. Her mother was dearer to her than ever, dearer through the excess of her mistaken confidence in Willoughby, and she was wildly urgent to be gone. Eleanor, unable herself to determine whether it was better for Marianne to be in London or at Barton, offered no counsel of her own except of patience till their mother's wishes could be known, and at length she obtained her sister's consent to wait for that knowledge. Mrs. Jennings left them earlier than usual, for she could not be easy till the Middletons and Palmers were able to grieve as much as herself, and positively refusing Eleanor's offered attendance, went out alone for the rest of the morning. Eleanor, with a very heavy heart, aware of the pain she was going to communicate, and perceiving by Marianne's letter how ill she had succeeded in laying any foundation for it, then sat down to write her mother an account of what had passed, and entreat her directions for the future, while Marianne, who came into the drawing room on Mrs. Jennings going away, remained fixed at the table where Eleanor wrote, watching the advancement of her pen, grieving over her for the hardship of such a task, and grieving still more fondly over its effect on their mother. In this manner they had continued about a quarter of an hour, when Marianne, whose nerves could not then bear any sudden noises, was startled by a rap at the door. Who can this be? Oh God, cried Eleanor, so early too. I thought we had been safe. Marianne moved to the window. It is Colonel Brandon's, she said with vexation. We are never safe from him. Jesus. Oh, Colonel Brandon. He will not come in as Mrs. Jennings is from home. I will not trust to that, retreating to her own room. A man who has nothing to do with his own time has no conscience in his intrusion of that of others. The event proved her conjecture right, though it was founded on injustice and error, for Colonel Brandon did come in, and Eleanor, who was convinced that solicitude for Marianne brought him thither. Thither? I hope it's thither. And who saw that solicitude in his disturbed and melancholy look, and his anxious though brief inquiry after her, could not forgive her sister for esteeming him so lightly. I met Mrs. Jennings in Bond Street, said he, after the first salutation, and she encouraged me to come, and I was the more easily encouraged because I thought it probable that I might find you alone, which I was very desirous of doing. My object, my wish, my sole wish in desiring it, I hope, I believe it is to be a means of giving comfort. No, I must not say comfort. Not present comfort, but conviction, lasting conviction in your sister's mind. My regard for her, for yourself, for your mother. Will you allow me to prove it by relating some circumstances which nothing but a very sincere regard, nothing but an earnest desire of being useful, I think I am justified, though where so many hours have been spent in convincing myself that I am right. Is there not some reason to fear I may be wrong? He stopped. Oh, Colonel. Oh, spit it out. I understand you, said Eleanor. You have something to tell me of Mr. Willoughby that will open his character farther. Your telling it will be the greatest act of friendship that can be shown Marianne. My gratitude will be ensured immediately by any information tending to that end, and hers must be gained by it in time. Pray, pray, let me hear it. Dad, do you think you could hit the side of the bowl with your spoon any more times? Do you think maybe just a couple more? Sorry. You shall, and to be brief, when I quitted Barton last October, but this will give you no idea, I must go farther back. You will find me a very awkward narrator, Miss Dashwood. I hardly know where to begin. A short account of myself, I believe, will be necessary, and it shall be a short one. On such a subject, sighing heavily, I can have little temptation to be diffuse. He stopped a moment for recollection, and then, with another sigh, went on. You have probably entirely forgotten a conversation. It is not to be supposed that it could make an impression on you. A conversation between us one evening at Barton Park. It was an evening of a dance, in which I alluded to a lady I had once known as resembling in some measure your sister Marianne. Indeed, answered Eleanor, I have not forgotten it. He looked pleased by this remembrance, and added, if I am not deceived by the uncertainty, the partiality of tender recollection, there is a very strong resemblance between them, and as well in mind as person, the same warmth of heart,
the same eagerness of fancy and spirits. This lady was one of my nearest relations, an orphan from her infancy, and under the guardianship of my father. Okay, we're fine. Our ages were nearly the same, and from our earliest years we were playfellows and friends. I cannot remember the time when I did not love Eliza, and my affection for her as we grew up was such as perhaps, judging from my present forlorn and cheerless gravity, you might think me incapable of having ever felt. Hers, for me, was, I believe, as fervent as the attachment of your sister to Mr. Willoughby, and it was, though from a different cause, no less unfortunate. At 17, she was lost to me forever. She was married against her inclination to my brother. Her fortune was large, and our family estate much encumbered. Yikes, that sucks. And this, I fear, is all that can be said for the conduct of one who was at once her uncle and guardian. My brother did not deserve her. He did not even love her. I had hoped that her regard for me would support her under any difficulty. And for some time it did. Oh my God, wow. Oh my gosh, this is all in Brandon's voice. Woofda. Okay. It's like the next 2 pages, so everybody buckle in. And for some time it did, but at last the misery of her situation, for she experienced great unkindness, overcame all her resolution, and though she had promised me that nothing, but how blindly I relate, I have never told you how this was brought on. We were within a few hours of eloping together for Scotland. Oh my God! The treachery or the folly of my cousin's maid betrayed us. I was banished to the house of a relation far distant, and she was allowed no liberty, no society, no amusement, till my father's point was gained. I had depended on her fortitude too far, and the blow was a severe one. But had her marriage been happy so young as then I was, a few months may have reconciled me to it, or at least I should not have now to lament it. This, however, was not the case. My brother had no regard for her. His pleasures were not what they ought to have been, and from the first he treated her unkindly. The consequence of this, upon a mind so young, so lively, so experienced at Mrs. Brandon's, was but too natural. She resigned herself at first to all the misery of her situation, and happy had it been if she had not lived to overcome those regrets which the remembrances, one day I will get this word, which the remembrance of me occasioned. But can we wonder with such a husband to provoke inconstancy, and without a friend to advise or restrain her? For my father lived only a few months after their marriage, and I was with my regiment in the East Indies. She should fall. Had I remained in England, perhaps, but I meant to promote the happiness of both by removing from her for years, and for that purpose had procured my exchange. The shock which her marriage had given me, he continued in a voice of great agitation, was of trifling weight, was nothing to what I felt when I heard, about 2 years afterwards, of her divorce. Ooh, that's a big word. It was that which threw this gloom, even now the recollection of what I'd suffered. He could say no more, and rising hastily, walked a few minutes about the room. Eleanor, affected by his relation, and still more by his distress, could not speak. He saw her concern, and coming to her, took her hand, pressed it, and kissed it with a grateful respect. A few minutes more of silent exertion enabled him to proceed with composure. It was nearly 3 years after this unhappy period before I returned to England. My first care, when I did arrive, was Shiv, I'm really glad you're still saying Zunsa. I know, I was just thinking about Newland. I lost it. My first care, when I did arrive, was of course to seek for her, but the search was as fruitless as it was melancholy. I could not trace her beyond her first seducer, and there was every reason to fear that she had removed from him only to sink deeper in a life of sin. Oh no, a life of sin. Her legal allowance was not adequate to her fortune, nor sufficient for her comfortable maintenance, and I learnt from my brother that the power of receiving it had been made over some months before to another person. He imagined and calmly Could he imagine it, that her extravagance and consequent distress had obliged her to dispose of it for some immediate relief? At last, however, and after I had been 6 months in England, I did find her. Regard for a former servant of mine, who had since fallen into misfortune, carried me to visit in a sponging house. I don't want to know what a sponging house is. Where he was confined for debt, and there, in the same house, under a similar confinement, was my unfortunate sister. Do not like him calling her sister. So altered, so faded, worn down by acute suffering of every kind. Hardly could I believe the melancholy and sickly figure before me, and to be the remains of the lovely, blooming, healthful girl on whom I had once doted. What I endured in so beholding her! But I have no right to wound your feelings by attempting to describe it. I have pained you too much already. That she was, to all appearances, in the last stage of her consumption was, yes, in such a situation, it was my greatest comfort. Life could do nothing for her beyond giving time for a better preparation for death, and that was given. I saw her placed in comfortable lodgings and under proper attendance. I visited her every day during the rest of her short life. I was with her in her last moments. Oh man, that's a heavy story. Again he stopped to recover himself, and Eleanor spoke her feelings in an exclamation of tender concern, and at the fate of his unfortunate friend. Your sister, I hope, cannot be offended, said he, by the resemblance I have fancied between her and my poor disgraced relation. Their fates, their fortunes cannot be the same. And had the natural sweet disposition of the one been guarded by a firmer mind or a happier marriage, she might have been all that you will live to see the other be. But to what does all this lead? I seem to have been distressing you for nothing. Ah, Miss Dashwood, a subject such as this, untouched for 14 years. It is dangerous to handle it all. I will be more collected, more concise. She left to my care her only child. Of course it's her child. Of course Colonel Brandon is the perfect gentleman and has never ever had a slip up, quote unquote. Who was then about 3 years old. Okay, if this was 14 years ago, the child was 3 14 years ago. Does that mean the child is now 17? Somebody else do that math. I don't want to know it. I don't want to know that math. Okay. She loved the child and had always kept it with her. It was a valued, precious trust to me, and gladly would I have discharged it in the strictest sense by watching over her education myself, had the nature of our situations allowed it. That's really bad. I can't believe that his quote-unquote daughter is 17 and Marianne is 16. That's not fun. That's not a good knowledge. Had the nature of our situations allowed it, but I had no family, no home, and my little Eliza was therefore placed at school. I saw her there wherever I could, and after the death of my brother, which happened about 5 years ago, which left me the possession of the family property, she frequently visited me at Delaford. I called her a distant relation, but I am well aware that I have in general been suspect of a much nearer connection with her. Okay. It is now 3 years ago. She had just reached, oh no, she is 17. Oh my God. It is now 3 years ago. She had just reached her 14th year, that I removed her from school to place her under the care of a very respectable woman, residing in Dorsetshire, who had the charge of 4 or 5 other girls about the same time of life, and for 2 years I had every reason to be pleased with her situation. But last February, almost a 12-month back, she suddenly disappeared. Oh my God. Oh, I need the tissue again. Oh, Colonel Brandon. Oh, Colonel Brandon. Oh, baby. Okay. I had allowed her, imprudently as it turned out, at her earnest desire, to go to Bath, with one of her young friends who was attending her father there for his health. I knew him to be a very good sort of man, and I thought well of his daughter. better than she deserved, for, with an most obstinate and ill-judged secrecy, she would tell nothing, would give no clue, though she certainly knew all. He, her father, a well-meaning but not quick-sighted man, could really, I believe, give no information, for he had been generally confined to the house, while the girls were ranging over the town and making what acquaintance they chose, and he tried to convince me as thoroughly as he was convinced himself of his daughter's being entirely unconcerned in the business. In short, I could learn nothing but that she was gone. All the rest for 8 long months was left to conjecture. What I thought, what I feared may be imagined, and what I suffered too. Good heavens! Cried Eleanor. Could it be? Could Willoughby? The first news that reached me of her, he continued, came in a letter from herself last October. It was forwarded to me from Delaford, and I received it on the very morning of our intended party to Whitwell. And this was the reason for my leaving Barton so suddenly, which I am sure must at the time have appeared strange to everybody, and which I believe gave offence to some. Little did Mr. Willoughby imagine, I suppose, when his looks censured me for incivility in breaking up the party, I was called away to the relief of one whom he had made poor and miserable. But had he known it, what would it have availed? Would he have been less gay or less happy in the smiles of your sister? No, he had already done that, which no man can feel for another would do. He had left the girl whose youth and innocence he had seduced, and in a situation of the utmost distress, with no creditable home, no help, no friends, ignorant of his address. He had left her promising to return, but he neither returned nor wrote nor relieved her. Wow! This is beyond everything, exclaimed Eleanor. Damn, Colonel Brandon had the tea the whole time. His character is now before you, expensive, dissipated. I enjoy messing things up. I know what dissipated looks like. There are 2 S's in this one. My mom is taking a nap in my direct view on the couch. And can now give me in lifetime critiques of my reading. Yeah, see, dissipated has 2 P's. There's only one in here. Anyways. I've completely lost where I was on the page now. Okay. His character is now before you, expensive. I think it's dissipated. And worse than both. Knowing all this, as I have known it many weeks, guess what I must have felt on seeing your sister as fond of him as ever, and on being assured that she was to marry him. Guess what I must have felt for all your sakes. When I came to you last week and found you alone, I came determined to know the truth, though irresolute what to do when it was known. My behavior must have seemed strange to you, but now you will comprehend it. To suffer you all to be so deceived, to see your sister. But what could I do? I had no hope of interfering with success, and sometimes I thought your sister's influence might yet reclaim him. But now, after such dishonorable usage, who can tell her what were his designs on her? Whatever they may have been, however she may now, and hereafter doubtless will, turn with gratitude towards her own condition, when she compares it with that of my poor Eliza, when she considers the wretched and hopeless situation of this poor girl, and pictures her to herself, with an affection for him as strong, still as strong as her own, and with a mind tormented by self-reproach, which must attend her through life. Surely this comparison must have its use with her. She will feel her own sufferings to be nothing. They proceed from no misconduct and can bring no disgrace. On the contrary, every friend must be made still more her friend by them. Concern for her unhappiness and respect for her fortitude under it must strengthen every attachment. Use your own discretion, however, in communicating to her what I have told you. You must know best what will be its effect, but I have not seriously and from my heart believed it to be of service. Might lessen her regrets, I would not have suffered myself to trouble you with this account of my family afflictions, with a recital which may seem to have been intended to raise myself at the expense of others. Eleanor's thanks followed this speech with grateful earnestness. attended to with the assurance of her expecting material advantage to Marianne from the communication of what had passed. I have been more pained, said she, by her endeavours to acquit him than by all the rest, for it irritates my mind more than the most perfect conviction of his unworthiness can do. Now, though at first she will suffer much, I am sure she will soon become easier. Have you, she continued after a short silence, ever seen Mr. Willoughby since you left him at Barton? Yes, he replied gravely. Once I have. One meeting was unavoidable. Eleanor, startled by his manner, looked at him anxiously, saying, What? Have you met him to— I could meet him in no other way. Eliza confessed to me, though most reluctantly, the name of her lover, and when he returned to town, which was within a fortnight after myself, we met by appointment, he to defend and I to punish his conduct. We returned unwounded, and the meeting therefore never got abroad. Oh my God, they had a duel. They dueled. Wow. Anyways, we like Colonel Brandon. Eleanor sighed over the fancied necessity of this, but to a man and a soldier she presumed not to censure it. Such, said Colonel Brandon after a pause, has been the unhappy resemblance between the fate of mother and daughter, and so imperfectly have I discharged my trust. Is she still in town? No, as soon as she recovered from her lying in. Oh, God. For I found her near delivery. I removed her and the child into the country, and there she remains. Recollecting soon afterwards that he was probably dividing Eleanor from her sister, he put an end to his visit, receiving from her again the same grateful acknowledgments, and leaving her full of compassion and esteem for him. Willoughby is like the worst man ever. Like, wow. Okay. It's literally took me 30 minutes to read that chapter. And I'm trying to keep up okay, it's a short one. The next one's short. So we're just like a really long series of chapters. Okay. Let's see how Marianne takes this. You're right, duels are fun. When the particulars of this conversation were repeated by Miss Dashwood to her sister, as they very soon were, the effect on her was not entirely such as the former had hoped to see. Not that Marianne appeared to distrust the truth of any part of it, for she listened to it with the most steady and submissive attention, made neither objection nor remark, attempted no vindication of Willoughby, and seemed to show by her tears that she felt it to be impossible. But though this behavior assured Eleanor that the conviction of his guilt was carried home to her mind, though she saw with satisfaction the effect of it in her no longer avoiding Colonel Brandon when he called, in her speaking to him, even voluntarily speaking, with a kind of compassionate respect, and though she saw her spirits less violently irritated than before, she did not see her less wretched. Her mind did become settled, but it was settled in a gloomy dejection. She felt the loss of Willoughby's character yet more heavily than she had felt the loss of his heart. His seduction and desertion of Miss Williams, the misery of that poor girl, and the doubt of which his designs might once have been on herself, preyed altogether so much on her spirits that she could not bring herself to speak of what she had felt even to Eleanor, and brooding over her sorrows in silence, gave more pain to her sister than could have been communicated by the most open and most frequent confession to them. To give the feelings or the language, okay, I think he didn't tell her because he knew that, like, she's like, listen, she doesn't like me that much, like, she's not comfortable with me, but she's really comfortable. I respect his decision to tell Eleanor, to have Eleanor tell Marianne, because, like, listen, he's, I wish he wasn't 35. Okay. Gave more pain to her sister than could have been communicated by the most open and most frequent confession of them. To give the feelings or the language of Mrs. Dashwood on receiving and answering Eleanor's letter would be only to give a repetition of what her daughters had already felt and said, of a disappointment hardly less painful than Marianne's, and an indignation even greater than Eleanor's. Long letters from her, quickly succeeding each other, arrived to tell all that she suffered and thought, to express her anxious solicitude for Marianne, and entreat she would bear up with fortitude under this misfortune. Bad indeed must the nature of Marianne's affliction be, when her mother could talk of fortitude. Mortifying and humiliating must the origin of these regrets, which she could wish her not to indulge. Against the interest of her own individual comfort, Miss Dashwood had determined that it would be better for Marianne to be anywhere at that time than at Barton, where everything where everything within her view would be bringing back the past in the strongest and most afflicting manner, and constantly placing Willoughby before her, such as she had always seen him there. She recommended it to her daughters, therefore, by all means not to shorten their visit to Mrs. Jennings, the length of which, though never exactly fixed, had been expected by all to comprise at least 5 or 6 weeks. A variety of occupations, of objects, and of company, which could not be procured at Barton, would be inevitable there, and might yet, she hoped, cheat Marianne, at times, into some interest beyond herself, and even into some amusement, much as the idea of both might now be spurned to her. From all danger of seeing Willoughby again, her mother considered her to be at least equally safe in town as in the country, since his acquaintance must now be dropped by all who called themselves her friends. Design could never bring them in each other's way, negligence could never leave them exposed to a surprise, and chance had less in its favor in the crowd. Its crowd is spelled crud, interesting, of London than even in the retirement of Barton, where it might force him before her while paying that visit at Allenham on his marriage with Mrs. Dashwood, from foreseeing at first as a probable event, had brought herself to expect as a certain one. She had yet another reason for wishing her children to remain where they were. A letter from her son-in-law had told her that he and his wife were to be in town before the middle of February, and she judged it right that they should sometimes see their brother. Okay, that means Edward's sister is coming to town. Marianne had promised to be guided by her mother's opinion, and she submitted to it, therefore, without opposition, though it proved perfectly different from what she had wished and expected, though she felt it to be entirely wrong, formed on mistaken grounds, and that, by requiring her longer continuance in London, it deprived her of the only possible alleviation of her wretchedness, the personal sympathy of her mother, and doomed her to such society, such scenes as must prevent her even knowing a moment's rest. But it was a matter of great consolation to her that what brought evil to herself would bring good to her sister, and Eleanor, on the other hand, suspecting that it would not be in her power to avoid Edward entirely, comforted herself by thinking that though their longer stay would therefore militate against her own happiness, it would be better for Marianne than an immediate return into Devonshire. Her carefulness in guarding her sister from ever hearing Willoughby's name mentioned was not thrown away. Marianne, though without knowing it herself, reaped all its advantage, for neither Mrs. Jennings nor Sir John, nor even Mrs. Palmer herself, ever spoke of him before her. Eleanor wished that the same forbearance could have extended towards herself, but that was impossible, and she was obliged to listen day after day to the indignation of them all. Sir John could not have thought it possible. A man of whom he had always okay. Okay, I think this is like notes, so I'm not going to do it in their voices. They're like in quotations, but they're not in quotations. So, a man of whom he had always had such reason to think well, such a good-natured fellow. He did not believe that there was a bolder rider in England. Yes, that's the marker of a good person. It was an unaccountable business. He wished him at the devil with all his heart. He would not speak another word to him, meet him where he might for all the world. No, not if it were to be by the side of Barton Covert. And they were kept waiting for 2 hours together. Such a scoundrel of a fellow, such a deceitful dog. Oh my god, I love that. I'm gonna start a hot dog stand and call it Deceitful Dogs. What do you serve a deceitful dog? This is my breakdown for this book. Okay. It was only the last time they had met he had offered him one of Folly's puppies, and this was the end of it. Mrs. Palmer, in her way, was equally angry. She was determined to drop his acquaintance immediately, and she was very thankful that they had never been acquainted with him at all. She wished with all her heart Combe Magna was not so near at Cleveland, but it did not signify, for it was a great deal too far off to visit. She hated him so much that she was resolved never to. I'm sorry, I'm still thinking about Deceitful dogs. Oh man. Okay. I'm gonna take a minute. Okay. Whew. She hated him so much that she was resolved never to mention his name again. Okay. Whew. It's been a long day. She was resolved never to mention his name again, and she should tell everybody she saw how good for nothing he was. The rest of Mrs. Palmer's sympathy was shown in procuring all the particulars in her power of the approaching marriage and communicating them to Eleanor. She could soon tell at what coachmakers the new carriage was building, by what painters Mr. Willoughby's portrait was drawn, and at what warehouse Miss Grey's clothes might be seen. The calm and polite unconcern of Lady Middleton on the occasion was a happy relief to Eleanor's spirits, oppressed as they often were by the clamorous kindness of the others. It was a great comfort to her to be sure of exciting no interest in one person at least among their circle of friends, and a great comfort to know that there was one who would meet her without feeling any curiosity after particulars or any anxiety for her sister's health. Every qualification is raised at times by the circumstances of the moment to more than its real value, and she was sometimes worried down by officious condolence to a rate good breeding as more indispensable to comfort than good nature. I don't think I read that sentence in any semblance of comprehensibility. Lady Middleton expressed her sense of the affair about once every day, or twice if the subject occurred very often, by saying, "It is very shocking indeed," and by the means of this continual though gentle vent, was able not only to see the Miss Dashwoods from the first without the smallest emotion, but very soon to see them without recollecting a word of the matter, and having thus supported the dignity of her own sex, and spoken her decided censure of what was wrong in the other, she thought herself at liberty to attend to the interest of her own assemblies, and therefore determined, though rather against the opinion of Sir John, that as Mrs. Willoughby would at once be a woman of elegance and fortune, to leave her card with her as soon as she married. Oh dear. Oh dear, Lady Middleton. Colonel Brandon's delicate, unobtrusive inquiries were never unwelcome to Miss Dashwood. He had abundantly earned the privilege of intimate discussion of her sister's disappointment, by the friendly zeal with which he had endeavored to soften it, and they always conversed with confidence. His chief reward for the painful exertion of disclosing past sorrows and present humiliations was given in pitying eye with which Marianne sometimes observed him, and the gentleness of her voice whenever, though it did not often happen, she was obliged or could oblige herself to speak to him. These assured him that his exertion had procured an increase of goodwill towards himself, and these gave Eleanor hopes of its being farther augmented hereafter. But Mrs. Jennings, who knew nothing of all this, who knew only that Colonel continued as grave as ever, and that she could neither prevail on him to make the offer himself, nor commission her to make it for him, began at the end of 2 days to think that, instead of midsummer, they would not be married till Michaelmas. Michaelmas? I don't know when it is, because it's not Christmas. And by the end of a week, that it would not be a match at all. The good understanding between the Colonel and Miss Dashwood seemed rather to declare that the honours of the mulberry tree, the canal, the yew arbour, would all be made over to her, and Mrs. Jennings had for some time ceased to think at all of Mr. Ferrars. So now Miss Jennings thinks that Colonel Brandon's going to get to Eleanor, which I still think is the right choice. And that Edward's dead, and that Marianne is just like going to go on in her life. Early in February, with a fortnight from the receipt of Willoughby's letter, Eleanor had the painful office of informing her sister that he was married. She had taken care to have the intelligence conveyed to herself as soon as it was known that the ceremony was over, as she was desirous that Marianne should not receive the first notice of it from the public papers, which she saw her eagerly examining every morning. She received the news with resolute composure, made no observation on it, and at first shed no tears, but after a short time they would burst out, and for the rest of the day she was in a state hardly less pitiable than when she had She first learnt to expect the event. The Willoughbys left town as soon as they were married, and Eleanor now hoped, as there could be no danger of seeing either of them, to prevail on her sister, who had never yet left the house since the blow first fell, she is a self-quarantining queen, to go out again by degrees as she had done before. About this time, the two Miss Steeles lately arrived at their cousin's house in Bartlett's Building, Holborn, presented themselves again before their more grand relation in Conduit and Berkeley Street, and were welcomed by them with great cordiality. Eleanor was sorry to see them. Their presence always gave her pain. Oh my God. And she hardly knew how to make a very gracious return to the overpowering delight of Lucy in finding her still in town. I should not have been quite disappointed if I had not found you where you were here still, she said repeatedly, with a strong emphasis on the word. But I always thought I should. I was almost sure you would not leave London yet awhile, and though you told me, at Barton, that you should not stay above a month. But I thought at the time that you would most likely change your mind when it came to the point. It would have been such a great pity to have went away before your brother and sister came. And now, to be sure, you will be in no hurry to be gone. I am amazingly glad you did not keep to your word. Eleanor perfectly understood her, and was not forced to use her self-command to make it appear that she did not. Well, my dear, said Mrs. Jennings, and how did you travel? Not in the stage, I assure you, replied Miss Steele, with quick exultation. We came post all the way, and had a very small beau to attend us at Dr. Davies. Dr. Davies was coming to town, so we thought we'd join him in a post-chaise, and he behaved very genteelly and paid 10 or 12 shillings more than we did. Oh, no. Oh, cried Mrs. Jennings. Very pretty indeed. And the doctor is a single man, I warrant you. There now, said Mrs. Steele, affectedly simpering. Everybody laughs at me so about the doctor, and I cannot think why. My cousins say they are sure I have made a conquest, but for my part, I declare I never thought about him from one hour's end to another. Lord, here comes your beau, Nancy, my cousin said the other day, when she saw him crossing the street to the house. My beau, indeed, said I. I cannot think who you mean. The doctor is no beau of mine. Patty finally instructed me that both versions of beau are pronounced beau, even though the French just decided one should not have an X and the other one should have an X, but they should be pronounced the exact same. Aye, it's very pretty talking, but it won't do. The doctor is the man I see. No, replied her cousin with affected earnestness. I beg you will contradict it if you ever hear it talked of. Mrs. Jennings directly gave her the gratifying assurance that she certainly would not, and Miss Steele was made completely happy. I suppose you will go and stay with your brother and sister, Miss Dashwood, when they come to town, said Lucy, returning after a cessation of hostile hints to the charge. No, I don't think we shall. Oh, yes, I dare say you will. Eleanor would not humour her by further opposition. What a charming thing it is that Mrs. Dashwood can spare you both for so long a time together. A long time indeed, interposed Mrs. Jennings. Why, their visit is just begun. Lucy was silenced. I am sorry we cannot see your sister, Miss Dashwood, said Miss Steele. I am sorry she is not well. For Marianne had left the room on their arrival. You are very good. My sister will be equally sorry to miss the pleasure of seeing you, but she has been very much plagued lately with nervous headaches, which make her unfit for company or conversation. Oh dear, that is such a pity. That is such a great pity. But such old friends as Lucy and me. I think she might see us, and I am sure we would not speak a word. Eleanor, with great civility, declined the proposal. Her sister was perhaps laid down upon the bed or in her dressing room, and therefore not able to come to them. Oh, if that is all, cried Miss Steele, we can just as well go and see her. Eleanor began to find this impertinence too much for her temper, but she was saved the trouble of checking it by Lucy's sharp reprimand, which now, as on many occasions, though it did not give much sweetness to the manners of one sister, was of advantage in governing those of the other. That is finally the end of those chapters. Again, really long chapter. I don't know if they're just getting longer now or what.
Okay, it seems like the next chapters are actually going to be 30 minutes instead of 50. Woo. I'm still reading. There's like a family meeting happening. What an interesting chapter. So I think to recap what Colonel Brandon said, Colonel Brandon loved this woman who was his father's ward, but not directly related to him. She was married off to his brother because she had a fortune. Colonel Brandon didn't need the fortune, but his brother did. They were a really bad match. She was super unhappy. Colonel Brandon was decided to elope with her, but then they got caught. And Colonel Brandon decided the best thing to do was to go to India and just be out of the way. So he went to India and was out of the way. But then he like hears that they're divorced. He comes back. Nobody knows where she is. And then he finally finds her like dying of consumption. And she's like, yo, will you please take my 3-year-old daughter? And he's like, yeah, of course. So the lady dies. He takes the daughter, like brings her up, lets her go to Bath one like summer, like the worst decision you could make as a father, apparently. At Bath, she meets Willoughby, runs off with Willoughby, begins a life of sin with him, and then becomes Willoughby, goes off at the same time to consort with Marianne. The letter that he got was the first time he had heard from this girl in over a year. He goes to her and she's like pregnant. And now he's like sent her off the country to just like be by herself. And anyways, woof. All right, that is all for today. I will let you fly. See you tomorrow. Tomorrow is Monday, so I will be in at 3 again. And hopefully I will see you then. Thanks for putting up with the super long chapter. All right, goodbye.